Yes, there we go. All right, so as Eric said, my name is Kaitlyn O'Connor, and tonight we are going to be talking about living mulch. So, there we go. Getting used to a new laptop every time, you know how it is. So in tonight's presentation, we are going to go over a couple of different topics. So first, I'm going to give a little bit more of an introduction about who I am and what ISG does. Then we are going to talk more about species selection for living mulch. Then we're going to move on to planting, different recommendations for how you would approach garden design. Should you use seeds or plugs? You know, how do you go about making those types of decisions for your garden? And then finally, we're going to end with the fun part where we're going to see a lot of photos from beautiful gardens that have utilized this concept in their own homes, so you can get some ideas and inspiration for what you can do at your own place. So ISG is a multidisciplinary design firm. We have a number of different services. We do architecture, engineering, planning, as well as environmental consulting. So I am a part of the environmental team, but I am also a part of the landscape architecture team. So I kind of wear two different hats within the organization. But my main role is to collaborate with this interdisciplinary team of civil engineers, water resource engineers, landscape architects, and environmental scientists to incorporate high quality restoration into projects and incorporate native biodiversity into the built environment. So what that looks like varies greatly depending on who the client is. You know, sometimes we have watershed districts or municipalities that are doing prairie restorations. Those are really fun. Sometimes we even have, you know, corporate campuses or industrial campuses that don't want to spend a bunch of money on irrigating bluegrass lawns, so they're putting in prairies as a low maintenance option instead. And sometimes it's me slyly sticking in Aronia and sumac into Aldi and U-Hauls around the US because they just want low maintenance shrubs and nobody's going to know the difference if it's a native or not. So, so we have kind of a big difference in kind of what those different types of plantings looks like, but I'm just always on a mission to incorporate native plants in whatever way that I can with whatever clients I can. So we have 12 different offices across the upper Midwest. You can see our geographies here on the PowerPoint presentation, and we've got 12 different business units in different sectors. Oh, and maybe I'll give a little background about myself too. So some of you may have heard talks from me before. I, in a previous position, was the education and outreach specialist for Prairie Moon Nursery down in Winona, Minnesota. I am also a resident member of Wiskoy Valley Community Land Cooperative, which is an intentional community where Prairie Moon Nursery was founded. So all of my neighbors have been involved with that organization in some way, shape, or form over the years. And my backyard are fields that Prairie Moon collects for seed. So I really am honored that I have a professional position where I can incorporate my passions. And I'm really happy to share some of that knowledge with you guys today. So, living mulch, what are we talking about here? So when I'm saying living mulch, I am using this sometimes interchangeably with green mulch. Those terms are sometimes swapped out for one another. But basically, it's this idea that we can use living plants as a mulch rather than these abiotic materials that we're used to seeing. And usually you're seeing like shredded hardwood mulch, or God forbid, rock mulch is often utilized in some places. Very, very tough on plants. Wouldn't recommend that if you can avoid it. But those are what we traditionally see in standard horticultural landscapes. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can absolutely use these spaces as another dimension of our plantings. And so here you can see very clearly a tree that has just standard mulch on it, that shredded hardwood mulch, and then the wild ginger that has a little understory here. Yeah. Oh, well, that's not great. I don't have notes. Is there a way to change the view? Oh, no. All right, Eric, I think you did it. All right, I think we got it.
Somebody wanted to be admitted though. Yeah, I said.
Okay, woo, thank you. Coming in with the tech support. Let's see now if I can advance my slides. There we go. All right. So here's another example of a more traditional aesthetic that you would see in more conventional horticultural designs. You have your mulch here, and contrast that with a very similar type of foundation planting using the same types of concepts, you know, a stone, a hard stone hardscape border, but instead of utilizing that abiotic mulch, you've actually got living plants taking up that space. So I also wanted to talk about a couple related gardening concepts that sometimes people use, again, interchangeably, but I think these are kind of distinct ideas. So I think it's great to kind of make that distinction for folks. So as members of Wild Ones, I hope you've all heard of the idea of soft landings. So Heather Holm and Leslie Pilgrim have done a beautiful job at pioneering this idea. And you could absolutely consider these soft landings as living mulch, especially under trees. So from my understanding of this concept, this is especially focused around those keystone woody species where you're going to have a lot of species of Lepidoptera, those butterflies and moths that are completing their life cycles on some of our keystone tree species like oaks and willow and other of those keystone species. So keystone species are basically this idea that you have some members of the plant community that are playing an outsourced role creating these connections between other organisms. And because they have this high degree of connectivity with other organisms in their environment, they are like the keystone. And without that species, you could see a lot of biodiversity collapse. So that is a really awesome gardening concept that is related, but not exactly the same. And another related gardening concept that you see in new perennialism, this is a movement within the landscape architecture and landscape design worlds where you are, instead of creating very like geometric, what I'm going to call like European style gardens, you're actually creating more of a stylized meadow. So it's moving closer to a, you know, like a prairie plant community, but it is absolutely intentional. It is absolutely designed. So as you can see in this space, this isn't a traditional European style garden, but it is still very beautiful. You can absolutely tell that there was someone who had a very keen eye for design creating this concept. And listed on the screen are two relatively famous landscape designers who utilize this style of gardening. And you're going to have your foundational matrix plants. So that's basically like you kind of create this matrix, usually of grassy species, that kind of forms your base. And then you have your punctuation plants, which are those focal points that kind of move your eye through the space. This is kind of your pops of color, your swaths. And then you have your focal points. And this is going to be like trees or fountains or statues. Related, but different. So why would anybody want to do living mulch in their garden, right? First and foremost, It's a great way to suppress weeds. When you have an open space in your garden, nature wants to fill that space with something else. So if you are intentionally filling those spaces in your garden, then the hope is that you'll have enough competition that it will keep weeding to a minimum once those plants are established and taking up that niche in the environment. Second, soil stabilization. This is really great, especially around foundation plantings. Soil stabilization can occur when you have water that is going to run around. And I know that we have had to deal a little bit with water around our house with big rains, where we've had to adjust kind of our gutters and our strategies for making sure water is moving out from the house. And we don't want to have little gullies or rills start to form. So this is a really great way to get some of those fibrous roots in the soil to hold that in place. And then related to erosion, you also have that moisture absorption. So because those roots are creating conduits through the soil profile, water can more easily infiltrate down into the soil profile and be absorbed on site rather than running off, where it can gather speed and gather soil particles and cause erosion. And then finally, empty space in your garden is potential wildlife habitat, right? Especially, we're going to talk about a number of different species that are really great choices, not only for nectar resources for our pollinators, but also as host plants. So you can just kick up the diversity, kick up the ecological value of your gardens by utilizing the space that often is overlooked and not planted. But there are some challenges with living mulch. So especially in my line of work, where we have a lot of clients who are plant blind, right? This idea that like a lot of people just see greenery and they can't identify species or can't really even differentiate between these different plants. It's just a bush. It's just a flower, right? And unfortunately, in my line of work, we do have plenty of clients that are like that. And they want a single species that's really clean. It's really easy for their groundskeepers to identify and maintain. Nothing fancy, right? So if you are going to utilize this approach, and honestly, this is going to be an approach that is utilized for most native gardeners, you have to have some affinity for species identification. You want to be able to know if you planted this little wild strawberry, that you can go back and you can know that that's what you planted and differentiate that from a weed that like a dandelion or a plantain that you would otherwise maybe want to pull from your garden, right? So usually this approach is taken by gardeners who are a little bit more savvy with their plant species. You also have increased garden design complexity. And again, for some gardeners, this is going to be really exciting because you can plug more plants into your design and create even more levels of interest and color and seasonality, right? But again, for some gardeners, this is really not what they want. So you got to know what you're getting yourself into. One other thing that can happen if you layer a lot of plants, especially plants that are of similar sizes, you can have decreased air circulation, which can increase fungal growth on plants. So how many people here have ever seen powdery mildew on Monarda? Yeah, all right. Okay, so Monarda is especially susceptible to powdery mildew, but a lack of air circulation can make some of those problems worse. So this kind of leads into the next point that can be a challenge, is that you do need to balance the garden community over time. Now, has anybody here planted their garden plugs way too close because they're really little when you get them and you don't realize this tiny little plug is going to turn into a 5-foot tall aster? Anyone? Just me? Just me? Okay. So especially when you're working with living mulch, some of these species, why we love them is because they spread on their own. And that can be a really great thing when you're trying to fill space and have a low maintenance garden. It can also be something that you need to keep in check, and you need to periodically edit those plants who are maybe doing a little bit too well, or they're taking over a space of a plant that you really want to keep in your design. So there are going to be some checks and balances that you're going to want to do. And, usually I like to go around and do little edits here and there every year. So if you are interested in putting some living mulch into your gardens, where do you start with species selection? So we'll just start with the basics. First and foremost, you got to find the right plant for the right place. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but you really need to understand your site conditions and work with that. Your life is going to be so much easier as a homeowner, as a gardener, if you can work with what you've got. If you have, really wet clay soils, it is going to be near impossible to get lupin to establish there. You can try, but it's going to be really challenging. So you want to think about your sun exposure. Is this a shady spot? Is this a sunny spot? You want to think about your soil moisture. Is this getting a lot of water because it's near a downspout, or it's near the bird bath that I tip over pretty frequently to wash out for the birds, right? So think about those little microclimates and soil moisture. And then you also want to think about the plant's behavior. So we are going to meet some of my favorite contenders for living mulch specimens in your garden, and we're going to talk a little bit about behavior patterns of those plants. And the behavior patterns are often tied to their preferred reproductive method. So whether they're spreading by seeds, stolons, rhizomes, etc. And the things that make a good living mulch plant are things that are relatively low growing compared to the other species that you have planted on site. And I think relatively low growing is a spectrum, and we're going to talk about some of the spectrum of plants in terms of height. You want something that spreads readily, and you also want something that is going to create a nice consistent ground cover. So we're going to start with some of the heavy hitters in the living mulch world. Now, these are some plants that I really, really love because they work in a lot of different scenarios. So the first two at the top, violets and wild strawberry, are my go-tos for sure. The reason that these are my go-tos are because they thrive in full sun and full shade, both of these plants, and they both spread readily, which is really nice. And violets and wild strawberry are good together because you are going to be taking advantage of both of their reproductive strategies and their behaviors. So your violets are going to predominantly spread by rhizomes. They do set seed, but honestly, violets are kind of hard to get growing from seeds. I don't know if you've ever tried to grow a violet from seed, but it's not the easiest thing to do. It's a lot easier for them to spread vegetatively through their rhizomes. And wild strawberries also spread vegetatively, but if you've ever grown a conventional strawberry, they kind of set out little runners and they almost like slinky across the landscape. And those little runners will find a little open niche of soil and plop down and set root. And then the next one will go and plop root and set down. So you're kind of utilizing these different reproductive strategies to fill up the space in your garden. So if you kind of put these in a pattern next to each other, they will fill in very quickly and occupy that space for you really well. So if you want to start somewhere, I would highly recommend starting with violets and wild strawberries. The other really nice thing about violets and wild strawberries is that they transplant really easily. And so if you start what I like to refer to as a mother colony, you get one area of your garden going really good, and then once those self-propagate, you can just in the spring like this dig up your little plants and then move them and keep expanding out into other areas of your garden. So you really only have to spend money getting those initial plugs, and then you let nature do the rest, and you can kind of have your own little mini nursery right in your own garden to utilize. Some other really great choices are wild ginger. Wild ginger is really going to only do best in the shade. It gets a little crispy on the edges if you try and grow it in full sun. So oftentimes, if you have a place where hostas are doing really well, your wild ginger might also do well there. So that's a nice swap out for those types of environments. And again, this one does prefer to propagate itself vegetatively, and is another one that's really great candidate for you propagating yourself in your own garden, because you can break off those little rhizomes and you can propagate a lot of ginger from those rhizomes. So this is another great one that you can start with a little bit, and then over the years you can have it spread so you don't have to do everything all at once. So Canada anemone is another one that I really like because it's a very it's a ground cover that is going to spread very readily, but I will say that this one might be a little too aggressive. So I would use this one sparingly, but it does create a really beautiful ground cover, and in the right spot, in the right location, it can work really well. So now we're going to talk some more about some full sun. So let's say maybe you've got a nice serviceberry or another shrub that you have, and you have a lot of sun around it. Maybe that's not casting a lot of shade like the canopy of a tree would, so to speak, right? So you might consider some of these species instead for living mulch in that type of situation. So pussy toes is one of my favorites for a ground cover. These can cover entire areas and be very, very beautiful. They can also be utilized as a ground cover in pathways. They tolerate light foot traffic. We're going to see an example later on in the presentation of somebody who used pussy toes as the pathway through their garden and used other heights of plants to kind of frame that walkway. Gorgeous, gorgeous garden design. And who doesn't want to walk on a quaint little path of pussy toes? Like, is that not the most darling thing? Yeah. Yeah, so it can depend on the soil conditions and the moisture conditions, but they can be, anywhere from about 3 inches tall to when they're fully flowering, maybe 8 inches tall. So again, it is going to depend on how rich your soil is. They're going to get larger in really rich loams that have a good moisture amount in them. But when you find them out in the wild, they're usually in really sandy soils and really tough areas. So this is an especially great choice if you have a sandy, dry, tough spot where you're having a tough time getting other things established. Pussy toes will very likely be a good contender to try in a site like that. Prairie smoke is another really enchanting one that can be used in full sun or partial shade. This also spreads by rhizomes, but very slowly. I would consider this a much more conservative species compared to the other plants that we've talked about so far. But it is really gorgeous, and especially if you want to add little pops of color in there, it's a very pretty pink hue that gets that wispy seed head on it. And then one of my personal favorites, Jacob's Ladder. I have this all over in my garden. It reseeds pretty readily, at least in my garden. Maybe others, I'm seeing some head nods. Sounds like other people are having that experience as well. So if you have a sunny enough space, I really like to incorporate Jacob's Ladder along with my violets and my wild strawberries, because then you have 3 different reproductive strategies that your living mulch ground cover community is utilizing in order to reproduce. You've got rhizomes, you've got stolons, and then you've got seeds. So hopefully that will be a good strategy to cover that space in a relatively short period of time and make sure that that plant community stays healthy and happy through time. Some other living mulch options that you might consider are Canada Mayflower. I think that this looks really similar to Lily of the Valley, and it behaves in a very similar way as well. So this is a really great native swap out, but it is going to do best in wetter soils, wetter, richer soils. Partridge pea is also a fun one. I like partridge pea because you can actually seed this into a lawn and mow it, and it flowers short. And we found this out at Prairie Moon because it escaped the production beds, and then it is just like growing everywhere in the mowed pathways. So that was a fun accident to learn from. But partridge pea can get a little bit taller, especially in a garden setting. So some of these now, we are starting to move beyond what I think what most gardeners would consider ground covers, where you're keeping pretty low to the ground, like maybe like maximum 8 inches tall or so. However, I'd like to give some other options because some of these may work in certain situations, especially if you have like a nice statement tree, you know, like maybe you've got a nice service berry on the corner of your house and that is giving you a little bit more height to your garden. And so you want something that's not quite a ground cover, but still low growing. So partridge pea could be a good option for that. And that readily self-sows. It's an annual. So again, if you're thinking about incorporating different types of life cycles and different types of propagation methods, this is a really great one to fit that annual self-sowing niche. Wild geranium is great. I like to pair wild geranium with something that is going to be greener later on in the summertime, because wild geranium starts to look a little sad in the late summer. So it's absolutely gorgeous in the spring though. It's very enchanting, but I love to pair this with maybe ferns or other species that are going to look more robust and green and their best a little bit later on in the summer to kind of hide the leaves that are going to kind of start to die back from those wild geranium plants. Yeah, so I usually like that honestly is my go-to for wild geraniums, but also you could consider some sedges. We're going to be talking about sedges as well. There are a number of those that have really nice color later on in the season. And so not only that, but then you also have a variation of texture because the wild geraniums have these nice big broad leaves and the sedges have really nice fine wispy textures. So yeah, sedges and ferns are usually my go-tos. And it just so happens that those are their companion plants in the native plant communities that you find naturally out in our forest systems. So I also like to consider those types of palettes and how that succession would happen out in a woodland that is not managed by a gardener. But I think that those could be some really great pairs. And then Bush's poppy mallow. This is one that is kind of a nice edger, especially if you've got like a retaining wall or a rock wall, because it grows almost like laterally over the ground. And it would be almost like, you know, those like petunias that you see in containers that spill over the sides of containers. That's what this is going to do over like a rock wall or like creeping phlox or something. So it's going to spread laterally and kind of pour over the sides of things. So might not be good for a garden bed where you're edging and mowing all the way up to the side of it, because this is going to want to creep out. But if you have that opportunity for a waterfall effect, this is going to be a great one for you. I also love this color in combination with black-eyed Susans and purple coneflower. And just like, it's just like the most, it just reminds you of being like in the Caribbean or something, because you have this like vibrant yellow, purple, and hot pink. So it can be a really fun color palette to work with. So on to our sedges. So sedges are an awesome choice for living mulch. And this is an especially great choice if you have a lot going on elsewhere in your garden and you want to keep a relatively like calm aesthetic. And that is not everybody's approach to garden design, right? Like I definitely have some crazy gardens where I'm just like, I'm getting all the plants that are just like discarded from Prairie Moon and my neighbor threw out and put on their driveway and whatever, right? So like, there can be a lot going on in gardens, and that I'm 100% behind that. But if you are a gardener who likes a little more tidy aesthetic and you want to utilize native plants, but you do kind of also like that more manicured European geometric aesthetic, you can utilize these as a living mulch and it gives a really, really clean look. Just instead of, you know, having that like clean rock or shredded mulch, these types of sedges can also be really nice. So again, I'm going to start with the two heavy hitters here. So first and foremost, we have Pennsylvania sedge. This is perhaps one of the most popular sedges to use, not only because it can be utilized instead of lawn, but it is a really adaptable sedge that can grow in a lot of different environments. It's tolerant to salt. So it it gets a reputation for a reason, I guess I'll say. The only thing that isn't as great about Pennsylvania sedge is that because it's so popular, it can often be hard to find commercially, and it is pretty much impossible to start from seed. For whatever reason, you know, that it just prefers to propagate and reproduce itself vegetatively. Prairie Moon always collects a small amount of seed because we would always get customers who insisted they want to try it. And like, God bless, like, go for it, please do. And if anybody cracks the code, there is a very lucrative native lawn business that is out there waiting for you. But in the nursery industry, basically the method of propagation is, you know, having this, you know, mother patch, and then you're propagating it out from there, and you're taking little bits of it from the inside to thin it out, and then putting those into plugs and then getting them to folks. So it can be difficult to propagate, and therefore it is also less likely to find high quantities on the commercial market. Is there a question in back?
Yeah, so we got this. How often can you divide it? We've moved a little bit of it, and we find that we can seemingly keep dividing it, and it's really happy, but if we be doing it too much.
Yeah, so I think observation is key. Different patches are going to respond differently to the division, and there's going to be some populations that are healthy enough that they'll absolutely tolerate that. And if you've got a really solid, a naturally occurring solid stand of Pennsylvania sedge, that is really one of the best places to propagate from. So I would say as long as you are not seeing a decrease in the overall stand of your population, you're doing it in a sustainable manner. And generally speaking, I like to only take about 30% maximum from any given population to be sure that you are not unsustainably harvesting or transplanting from that area. And I would say that is a great place to start, and that you need to observe and be responsible at thinking and looking, is this population responding okay to this, or is it clear that the population is declining? So hopefully that answers your question. But like so many things in the botanical world, the answer is it depends. So another popular one to use for sedges as living mulch is the white tinged sedge, which is Carex albicans. I've seen a couple other common names depending on where in the country you're purchasing this from, but Carex albicans is the scientific name for that one. And this is another really great one. Thrives in full shade to part shade. So a really great choice if you have a large tree, or you have some other vegetation that's going to shade it out for most of the time. But it's also really short, and it's like a little bit tidier, I would say, than the Pennsylvania sedge. So that's an awesome choice. Ivory sedge is another one that is super, super short and is really great for dry soils. And fox sedge I put in here, again, now we're kind of veering into sedges that maybe would not be considered ground cover. Fox sedge to me is almost like the sedge version of prairie dropseed visually. So it is a larger sedge. However, this can be a really great option for ground cover, especially in tough situations. Like, there's a spot in your yard that periodically floods for 3 to 4 days whenever it rains. I love fox sedge because it can take that inundation from water. It can be in full sun to part shade, and it can tolerate a lot of different soil types. So this also, as a fun fact, is utilized a lot in our native stormwater designs, because it is really easy to start from seed, propagates readily, it's cheap, and it can grow just about anywhere. So I wanted to add this one in here just as kind of like a tough, versatile sedge that is going to be taller and not necessarily a ground cover, but a good one to kind of have in your back pocket for the right situation. And so again, now we're kind of veering off again into less ground covers, but a little bit taller plants for the right situation. Prairie dropseed can be a beautiful ground cover. You can see in this photo that, you know, if you were to get up in here, I feel like it's a little misleading, because I'm sure if you walked up in this path, you know, that the prairie drop seed is going to be pretty tall. But it does provide a really nice ground cover if that's the vibe you're going for. Beet grass is one that is good, especially in shady areas, and it's excellent food for wildlife. So especially if you have like turkeys, or ground nesting birds in your area, beet grass is a really great source of food for them. So that is a great option for wildlife. And then path rush, like pussy toes, it can handle that foot traffic, as the name implies. So path rush is one that you may see on like naturally occurring on pathways, and it just kind of likes those compacted soils. So if you start to see like goat paths forming in your lawn or your garden where there are areas where lots of people walk, you might consider plugging in some path rush if whatever ground cover you're using is not tolerating that compaction from walking on it a lot. This could be a solution to still get native ground cover there instead of that little bare pathway. Okay, so now on to planting. The most important part of planting is site preparation. And some of us may have learned that the hard way when doing garden design. This is probably the least fun part of doing the gardening, in my opinion, but it has to be done. Otherwise, you're going to set yourself up for a lot more weeding in the future. So if you do site preparation thoroughly and properly, you are going to save yourself a lot of heartache and a lot of work later down the line. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can plant directly into old lawns as you are creating new garden beds, but you first have to kill the lawn. And if you're doing this without herbicides, I have seen people use old billboards, plastic tarps, greenhouse plastic, pretty much any type of like solid barrier, especially if you can get it in large sheets, where you can then pull it back after you're done using it. Because of course, I personally am not a huge fan of landscape fabric because it only works temporarily and things seed themselves on top of it. And then once you go to weed it out, it becomes impossible because the roots have grown into the top of the landscape fabric, and it's just kind of a nightmare after a while. I'm seeing some nods, so maybe some of you have had to try and deal with pulling up landscape fabric. But if you do need some weed suppression that is longer, and or you're not a super huge fan of having a giant sheet of plastic in your lawn for an extended period of time, you can go with the sheet mulching method. This is my preferred method. Pro tip, you can dumpster dive for refrigerator boxes at appliance stores to get really large sheets of cardboard that don't have like creases or things in them, because every time you're laying a new piece of cardboard is like the danger zone where things are going to try and pop up in between those creases. So the bigger pieces of cardboard you can get your hands on, the easier your life is going to be. And so you put down your cardboard. Also, I would recommend having a hose and you wet this really well as you're going, so a gust of wind doesn't take your whole cardboard puzzle off of your lawn in one big swoop. So wet it down or weigh it down with bricks or rocks or something as you're working, and then go over it right away with like 3 inches of hardwood mulch. And I know you're gonna be like, Kaitlyn, you're talking about getting rid of mulch. Now you're telling us to put more mulch on our gardens. Like, which one is it? But this is going to, number one, hold down your cardboard. It is going to give you a more aesthetically pleasing transformation where your neighbors will raise your eyebrows maybe a little less at you because this reads like you are doing a gardening project. And as we'll talk about a little later, you are going to have those little baby plugs, and you're going to need some weed suppression in the meantime until they grow into their full mature state. So what should you buy? Seeds, bare roots, or plugs? And what's the difference? So seeds are going to be your best option when you have something that you know readily propagates from seed. When you have if you have a really, really large area, you might consider utilizing seed because seed is way less expensive than buying live plant plugs is. But unfortunately, with living mulch, one of the things that makes a lot of the plants that we talked about good candidates for living mulch is that they propagate vegetatively and spread vegetatively. And usually plants kind of choose one or the other strategy. You're either something that propagates really readily from seed, or you're a plant that propagates really readily from vegetation. So there really is limited options that you can utilize with seed in this type of application. Bare roots are a really great choice, especially for anything that's considered a spring ephemeral or anything that is difficult to propagate. So these are more expensive than seed, but they're still, well, I guess it really depends on the species. Some species can be more expensive than a plug, but usually then we're talking about plants that are hard to grow in a greenhouse. So at least at Prairie Moon, the vast majority of bare root plants are grown as bare roots because it is really hard to grow them in the greenhouse. You just have to propagate them outside where they want to be. So this is especially great for rhizomatous plants. Honestly, if you have a rhizomatous plant, like really all that you're paying for is the root anyways. So just buy the root. You don't even need the top growth. But it freaks some gardeners out because when you get a bare root, it is like this little scraggly root that comes in a peat moss bag and you're like, this is it? This is my Dutchman's breeches? This little eraser-sized bulb in this bag? Like, what are you talking about? So you have to have a little faith with the bare roots because they don't look like much. And I always tell people to flag your bare roots because any good nursery is going to guarantee that those roots establish. And I've definitely gone on a planting spree before and I planted a bunch of bare roots and I was like, I didn't write any of this down. I have no idea what succeeded, what failed, where anything should be coming up. So if you either have a nice map where you're saying, okay, I planted X amount of these and they are here, then you can go back and do your due diligence and be like, hey, Prairie Moon or whoever, I had, 2 of my 7 plants fail, and then they can get you free replacements for those. And then finally, you have plugs. Plugs are really nice because they are instant gratification. You have that root in the plug, right? But you also have that above ground growth. So it's, it's a little easier and maybe less anxiety inducing to order plugs because you can clearly see where that plant is, and you can see if it's sad right away too. So, if you need to give it a little extra water, you can kind of monitor and observe the plants and see how they're responding to their new environment. But sometimes these can be the most expensive out of the 3. But now, especially if you are willing to order in like trays of 50 or trays of 32, which is not necessarily a bad thing to consider when you're talking about living mulch and like getting a pretty good solid area, you can get the economy of scale where you're gonna see your price per plant drop if you get a single species in a tray. It starts to get more expensive when you have the added labor of like mixing and matching different plugs all together. So if you can order a single species in one big tray, that's a really good bang for your buck. So installing, it's really important to be sure you're planting your plants at the right time. I'm sure you guys are all seasoned gardeners and you know this, but like try to avoid really hot and dry days. If you can wait till after a rain, it can be a lot easier to dig into your soil and get these plugs in, especially if you have utilized the mulching strategy where you're using cardboard and then your hardwood mulch on top. This is also going to be a lot easier to dig through the cardboard if the cardboard is really wet. So either after a nice rain or go out there and soak it with your hose before you're ready to plant, because then if you have your little soil knife, it's just going to cut right through that cardboard. And otherwise, if it's dry, you're going to have to like cut through the cardboard with your soil knife, and it's just a lot easier if everything's wet. And then of course, be sure that you're keeping your plugs out of the direct sunlight. You know, if you're laying things out and planting, and it's always fun to plant with people. So if you can make it a little neighborhood activity if you would like. Okay, so maintenance in the short term. The end goal is to replace your hardwood mulch for sure. But hardwood mulch is a really great weed suppression strategy when you have that first year and your plugs go in, because it's going to, I mean, these are perennial plants. They take a while to get to their full maturity. And so as you're waiting for things to fill in, that mulch is going to at least reduce the amount of weeds that you would have on site. And it also makes it look nice and clean when you're doing that transformation. But even if you have mulch, even if you have cardboard, I guarantee you, you're going to have weeds. The birds are going to drop them in. The wind is going to blow them in. Some of them may push up through the bottom of that cardboard where you have a crease in your overlap. So you are going to still need to do some weeding. This isn't, you know, it's lower maintenance, but not no maintenance. And then you may also need to water. Plants like about an inch rainfall per week. That used to be a relatively normal thing, but with climate change, we are seeing longer stretches in between our precipitation events, and then when it rains, it pours. We're seeing a lot larger, heavier rain events in the summer. So a light, consistent watering during that first year is going to go a really long way to ensure that your plants aren't desiccating and drying out and dying that first year. So it is good to have, you know, a sprinkler system or a hose or something where you have a plan for how to get water to those plants. And then in the long term, you may see that some plants end up doing well, and that was a really great plant for that place. And then there might be some other microclimates that you're learning about your garden, and you know, some things didn't really like it there. So you're gonna have to fill in any gaps that you see. And hopefully you can fill in those gaps with the plants naturally propagating themselves, and you can just do that in your garden, or you can go out to one of the many retailers or plant sales to fill those plugs. Another thing that I think is really important to think about long-term is how you are adding layers to your garden in space, but also in time. And what I mean by that is we're thinking about taking up garden space as in like what I'm going to call the lowest herbaceous layer in your garden, the ground cover mulch. And then you have your medium height plants. And then maybe you have, you know, your shrubs and trees and woody plants that are a little taller, right? So we're kind of like mimicking how you would have a natural plant community, you know, different layers in space. But different layers in time is also to think about how your plants are showcasing themselves throughout the season. So a really great example that we've already talked about is wild geranium. That is going to give your garden a really lovely look in the springtime, in that specific time. But you need to think about what that place in your garden is going to look like later on in the season. And so sometimes, you know, you don't know everything about every plant. And so you learn as you go. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about gardening is that it's always a learning experience. And every single season you can learn something new about a new plant. And so you just want to, you know, don't be intimidated or don't be discouraged by that. Like we're all gardeners learning together and learning about what works, especially when we're talking about using native plants in gardening. You know, there's still a lot to learn. And so you just want to be a keen observer and a good naturalist and be open to changing or modifying things if what your original plan isn't quite working out how you thought it was going to. And like I was saying, also edit as needed. This is a great opportunity to share with your friends. If your wild strawberry goes nuts, and often it does. And you're like, I don't even know what to do with all these runners. You know, you can just snip them all off and trade them at a Wild Ones event, right? Okay, so now the funnest part. Garden inspiration. So here are some photos. I'll say that these were used with permission from Prairie Moon Nurseries customers, as well as the Wild Ones group. A lot of these photos that you're going to see are either shared within newsletters in the Wild Ones organizations and or through the Facebook group. So if you're into social media and you're on Facebook, I would highly suggest the Native Plant Gardeners of the Upper Midwest Facebook group, because there is a lot of great gardeners across the Upper Midwest who share photos of their garden, and you can get some really great ideas from folks on there. So here we've got a really simple garden design, but it's classic and it works in so many situations. So this is just your wild ginger underneath of a tree. Great place to start. Now we're going to the other side of the pendulum, where we've got a lot of diversity in this garden. But I think that this showcases how you can use a lot of diversity and it can still read well on the landscape. So this is Sheila Leary's garden. She's a member of Wild Ones, and she is utilizing a lot of living mulch and ground cover in her garden. So you can see here, she's got the violets, she's got the Jacob's ladder, she's got the sedges, all working together with those different textures and colors that makes for a really interesting garden palette. Then you can kind of see too in the background there, let me minimize this. Here we go. So you can see how she's using some elements of hardscape design as well. You've got the hardscaped path, you've got a nice bird bath, a nice fence that kind of delineates and breaks up the space. And then there's also some spring ephemerals in here. So I wouldn't be afraid to go crazy with some of these more dainty spring ephemerals as you plug them into the ground covers. Things like bluebells, Dutchman's breeches, spring beauty. Those are going to be really great choices. They're more expensive plants. So I don't know that I would necessarily, I mean, you could just decide that you're going to have a really big swath of bluebells. However, that is going to probably take a lot more time and a lot more money than it would to fill that space with something like violets or strawberries instead. So here's a couple more photos of different perspectives of Sheila's garden here. And I think it's really nice where you can see this this shrub. You know, this is kind of one of her accent plants there, and obviously still got lots of plants and lots of diversity all around here. But because these are in the springtime and it's lower growing ground cover, it still creates a really nice aesthetic with the low and then the taller shrub there. So here's some other strategies for different areas. These are all from Sarah Michael. So Sarah has got some violets that she's using as mulch in between. I think that looks like coreopsis and butterfly milkweed there. So this is really great for her boulevard walkway. And here you can also see what Pennsylvania sedge and little blue stem look like in mass plantings, as well as this photo from Prairie Nursery that has the longbeak sedge, wild geranium, and plantain leaf sedge all next to each other. And I think this is really lovely where you can group your native mulch species, so you can create a little bit larger of kind of like a texture grouping together. And especially with flowers that have nectar resources, there is research that suggests it is easier for pollinators to find floral resources if you group them together in that way. So this is a common garden strategy, not only for aesthetic purposes, but also for pollinators. Oopsies. Again, rockstar Pennsylvania sedge, utilizing this photo. And then prairie drop seed, so you're kind of creating slightly different heights. So your Pennsylvania sedge is a lower growing species, but the prairie drop seed has a very similar texture. It's just a larger plant. So you can kind of play on those types of themes with texture and height for your garden design. And I also really loved this picture because this to me looks like it was converted from a very traditional garden aesthetic where you have your evergreen cultivars along this foundation planting, which is very typical of what you might see in a more, like stylized commercial setting. But then instead of utilizing that mulch, they just swapped it out. And here's where I'm talking about where you can still have a really clean aesthetic if that is what you're going for. And I think this is a great example of that, where this still reads very manicured, even though you're utilizing native plants as living mulch. Here's that photo I was talking about prior, where you can see the pussy toes were being utilized as a pathway. And you've got prairie drop seed on the edges. I love utilizing prairie drop seed as a border like this. I think it demonstrates more intentionality. And if you have a nice linear line of prairie drop seed and then just go nuts behind the drop seed, it kind of gives you this like contained and intentional aesthetic where I think it's more approachable and it's more readable, especially in an urban or suburban environment where you have hardscapes that you're juxtaposing right up against your garden. So I would love to see this type of garden design repeated as often as we see things like Karl Forster grass and hostas repeated in the landscape, right? Like I feel like this should be the new thing. I would love that. And of course, some of you may recognize this photo. This is Wild One member Heather Holmes' backyard. So Heather has got a beautiful garden that she's been working on for years. But here you can see how you can utilize a wide variety of species. And I don't know that I consider all of these living mulch ground covers, but they're all certainly lower growing. This still reads very well. You have that lower growing with the wild geranium, the wild ginger. Then we've also got, Virginia waterleaf, sedges, woodland phlox, trillium, bloodroot. So this is a really great example of utilizing a native plant community palette, because this is not unlike what a high quality woodland might look like out in nature. But of course, this has obviously been very intentionally designed and intentionally planted, but it mimics what that hardwood forest may have looked like. And it's not, it's not necessarily that these are like geometrically planted like we've seen in some of the other photos. This is a more naturalistic type of garden design, but still very beautiful. Here's some more with wild strawberry and sedges. I like this photo because you can see what predominantly wild strawberry looks like as a ground cover. You have these staccatos of the sedges that kind of pop up through there. But I just think the wild strawberry is just like such a great low growing ground cover that just holds that space really well. And I think this photo illustrates that nicely. But again, and here prairie drop seed, this is in the same homeowner's garden, but a different location. So you can see that the prairie drop seed is like utilized as that matrix grass for kind of a ground cover. And then those mid-height plants as the cream gentian kind of give that prairie drop seed a little more interest. And then as she has this planted along her rock wall, you're also kind of moving your eye through the space as it follows the hardscape around. Here's some more photos of that same garden from different perspectives. Here you can see this is that partridge pea that is kind of growing down here. Oopsies. And here you can see the wild strawberry with the prairie drop seed that is more mounded. And then this is actually my orchard. So I just wanted to show that you can utilize living mulch even in agricultural environments where you maybe we still need to mow this area because we're growing apple trees on our little homestead. And we need to manage that orchard. However, if you mow high, you can still have lots of these native plants in the understory of productive agricultural spaces. So here we've got lots of Jacob ladder, violet, and Virginia waterleaf that covers the ground in the springtime, which is really lovely. So there are a number of free resources available if you guys want to learn more. Wild Ones has this awesome handout. I believe it's available on the website that has some more species ideas for you. And there's also Soft Landings handouts. I actually just saw that there is a Story Maps webpage that just launched that has Soft Landings on there, and it's a really, really well done website. So if you haven't seen that yet, I would highly recommend checking that out. And then if you're interested in learning more about these like new perennialism within landscape architecture, where you have these more, I'll call them famous landscape designers who are utilizing some of this. These are some of my favorite books to pick up if you haven't read any of these yet. So Garden Revolution by Larry Weiner and Thomas Christopher. Larry Weiner is a prominent landscape architect out east. He does a lot of estates and high profile projects like the Statue of Liberty and the grounds at Yale and things like that. But beautiful, beautiful work, has awesome resources and methodologies for planning a stylized yet naturalistic meadow type garden. And Thomas Rainier and Claudia West, Planting in a Post-Wild World, is another really great one of my favorites. And then some of these as well. These are kind of like the foundational books I would consider of when new perennialism started to become a thing. So these are a little bit of a throwback at this point, but it's still a really great info, and I think is kind of like the foundation where a lot of these garden designers are getting some of their inspiration. So it's always nice to know who kind of broke ground with these types of concepts and how we're iterating on those themes now as we're learning more and more about this style of gardening. And with that, I will wrap it up and take any questions we might have. Oh, yes. There you go.
Awesome.
So I've got an area.
Oh, so hold on. So I'm going to bring the microphone because we have people on Zoom. So,
Oh, okay, sorry. I've got an area near Alexandria, Minnesota. It's just a copse of heavy trees, linden trees. So, because it's such a large area, what would you suggest if I would prefer to do it by seed?
When you say it's a large,
It's maybe 300 square feet.
it's like for 300 square feet, and you want to go with something that's low growing.
Yes.
Yep.
Or medium.
Yeah. So I would suggest going with a little blend in an area that large. If you're starting from seed, really like 300 square foot from seed is not going to be super expensive, even if you are overseeding a lot or using species that are a little bit more expensive. On that scale, I think this is still very approachable economically. And you might suggest asking for a custom seed mix from a vendor, and they're going to be interested to know what your soil is. And that is always my first question when I'm going through the design process. So are you familiar? For a clay loam? Sure. Yeah. So there are a number of species that could work here, but a lot of the species we talked about today are species that are difficult to start from seed. So we wouldn't want to necessarily start with those. Or Some of these are okay in shade, but shade is going to be your other limiting factor. So I think if you could stay with like 3 feet or below, that is going to give you a lot more diversity and a lot more likelihood to cover that space. Because if you're going for like 2 feet, 1 foot or below, that's going to be really hard for some of these plants. So with all that said, Virginia waterleaf, wild geranium, ginger. Yeah, you want to start that from plugs, but well, you can, it's hard to start from seed. I would definitely suggest starting from plugs. Yeah, Jacob's ladder could start from seed. Yep, and would be fine in shade. There's a number of sedges. Lots of sedges would work well in that area. The only thing sedges from seed you have to plant in the fall because they'll need to stratify over the winter to germinate. But things like sedges that are going to be adapted to shade would be a really nice ground cover. And then as long as you don't have cattle, dairy cattle, snake root is one of my favorites that will take over a space, and it's a beautiful white blooming flower. Sometimes it gets a little bit of a bad rap because people think it's weedy. It's almost like in the same vein as like touch me nots, impatience. How if you're in the right spot, impatience can be like very weedy. And so sometimes in some circles they get a bad rap, and I feel like snake root is almost the same way, where sometimes people are like, oh, it's like too aggressive, but it starts from seed beautifully, and it is going to give you lovely white flowers all over your woodland, which I think is great. So those are some that I would start with. And, you know, in woodland situations, when you're doing restorations, I'll also say that Virginia wild rye is often used as a cover crop or a filler. That's a taller grass, so I'm not entirely sure that that's going to be the best fit for your goals. But I think it's just handy to know that that is very often used as like a woodland cover crop when you're starting to do the conversion, because it's cheap, it's easy to grow, and you can utilize that to occupy some space while slower growing, more conservative things come in. Yeah.
So you've mentioned Virginia waterleaf a few times, and I must have gotten a Prairie Moon catalog or Prairie Nursery catalog, and I thought this sounds interesting, and I bought a few, and now I have a lot of it, and it's really moved around my yard. And a guy that helps me, who's a landscape guy with gardening a few times a year, he's like, pull it out. And so I just want, can you talk a little bit more about how aggressive or why you don't seem worried about that when other people might be?
This is a great question. So I feel like it goes on that theme of different people's perspective of what is a weed, right? So I love Virginia waterleaf personally because it does spread readily. It's a native. It's also edible. It makes a lovely salad if you didn't know that. So if you do need to edit things out, you can add that to your nettles and your other maybe undesirable natives that you can also eat as you're weeding. You absolutely can edit Virginia waterleaf. I feel like Virginia waterleaf is a ground cover plant that is usually most in need of editing, maybe up there with Canada anemone, as far as like how it can spread really readily. But it is very easy to pull. Like, it's fine. And it also, at least the Virginia waterleaf around the woods at my house, dies back in the later parts of the summertime. So it does, there's certain times of the year where you're like, this stuff is everywhere. But then later on in the season, it'll be phased out with, ferns or your snake root or nettle. That's what's in my woods that takes over where the Virginia waterleaf is. But it's also good to note that when the DNR and other botanists have gone out to do field surveys of the vegetation in maple basswood forests, especially in this area. Virginia waterleaf has a really high occurrence and abundance in natural systems. So if you were to go out in the woods, that is exactly what it would be like naturally. So I hesitate to, throw shade on Virginia waterleaf because that's its thing. Like that's what it has evolved to do. So it's great. But I think you should feel free to edit with abandon if it is getting into places where you don't want, because as you found, it does propagate readily. And if you need it to propagate somewhere else, you can do it pretty easily. But it is known to be a spreader.
And just speaking on Virginia waterleaf and maple basswood forest, from my experience, Wargo Nature Center, where the tour is next month, where I work, is maple basswood forest. Lots of Virginia. It looks really nice. A lot of other great diversity of things growing in there, and they seem to play along well with the Virginia waterleaf, at least in that context. But this is a much more wild setting. So obviously, within your own yard, do what you want. We did have 2 questions in the chat, so I thought I'd pop in with one of them. Deb is wondering, how do plants spread in areas with cardboard? Obviously, plants that you want to be spreading. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so after about a year, that cardboard is going to break down. So you're basically using that cardboard to suppress weeds, and then you're like digging through the mulch, puncturing through the cardboard, and then putting the roots into the soil. And so things that are going to propagate vegetatively are going to still propagate vegetatively through the soil. And then they'll be able to pretty easily pop up through that decomposing cardboard and shredded hardwood mulch after it breaks down after a year or 2.
Yes.
What do you recommend for your hardwood mulch?
I recommend double shredded natural wood, undyed. I have also used cedar in my gardens. Apparently this is a controversial wood to be using as mulch, but that's what's available at the Fleet Farm in Winona. And so that's what I get. And I haven't had any problems with it. But on all of my professional landscape designs that I'm doing for ISG, it is double shredded hardwood, undyed mulch.
It's a disc control. Is that one of the double shredding? Does it keep it from floating away when you put it down?
It can help. Yeah. I mean, if you get a big enough rain event, you might still lose some, but the double shredding does help it kind of lock onto each other. Yep, exactly right.
Right. Another question from the chat here. What plants would you recommend for light foot traffic, specifically like along the side of a house to get, let's see, along sides of house to get to lawn areas to mow? So like on the edge of the house, light foot traffic.
Yep. Pathrush, wild violets, wild strawberry, and pussy toes would be my top contenders. And which you choose will depend on how sunlight is hitting and what soil you have there, right? You always got to go back to those, what are the conditions that I have? But those would be my top contenders, and especially violets. I mean, violets grow in lawns and are walked on quite frequently. They can take a lot of foot traffic. And same with that path rush. So those would probably be my first go-tos. And then if it is a really sunny spot, especially a sunny spot with sandy soils, then I would go with more of like the pussy toes option.
Anyone in the audience? Oh, let's see.
How steep a hill can you plant on top of cardboard?
Not super steep. I don't know that I want to give you a slope ratio on the spot here, but yeah, mulch on slopes can be tricky. I'll say I live on the side of a bluff, so all of my gardens are sloped, and it's not a super steep slope. But I did have my strategy for the slopiest parts of my garden was to use bricks and stones to hold down the cardboard, because I also had to like bend the cardboard to match the slope, right? So I would get bricks to hold down the cardboard. And then when I poured my mulch, the stones and the bricks were covered up, but they also helped hold the mulch in place. So it was almost like kind of creating like a hidden stone erosion barrier along like the topography of that curve, and then the mulch would get stuck on that. And using double shredded hardwood mulch is going to help that from moving. But I used that, and I definitely, there was like 2 or 3 times throughout the summer where I needed to get my rake and kind of smoosh things back up a little bit to keep it in place. But you can do the cardboard and mulch on a slope with a little bit of help from some stones to hold things in place.
All right. In the chat, Kathy's wondering, or saying, we have a Sweater Norway maple in our yard that we would like to try to grow some type of low ground cover under. It is a large tree. What do you suggest?
I suggest abandoning the idea of ground cover under a Norway maple. Norway maples are an especially challenging tree species to establish anything underneath. And they have a lot of surface roots that are sucking moisture out of that soil profile at the top there. So it can be extraordinarily challenging to plant under Norway maples. It is a challenging spot though. So if you can, I would definitely say that you would need to have some sort of irrigation to get something established. And then when you are selecting your species, you need to select something that is adapted to very dry soils. Because even if your web soil survey or your soil around, like outside of the drip line of that Norway maple, is a nice medium loam, that there's a microclimate happening around the base of that Norway maple that is very, very dry. The Norway maple is also taking lots of other like nutrients and things out of the soil, but honestly, it's like a perpetual known thing in landscape design that this is like a particularly challenging environment. So that's probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's going to be a tough site.
All right. Guess a question back here.
So I was wondering, how far do you want to stay away from trees if you're going to use that cardboard method? Because I'm also thinking that sometimes when people mulch and do a lot of disturbance around trees, they're also hurting the roots near the trees. So is there, again, like a percentage, or how do you kind of look at that? Or is there a different approach altogether that you want to use, whether that be burlap or some other?
Get a couple extra seconds to think about it here as I run back and forth.
This is great. It's a good method. Yeah, so that's a really great point. You know, trees do have a lot of roots at the surface. That's where they're getting a lot of their water and nutrients and oxygen exchange from, right? So that area close to the base of a tree, you're absolutely right, can be very critical. So trees, when you're putting cardboard around them, I would recommend maybe like a 1 to 2 foot buffer to give your tree a nice breathing room. But the benefit of using something like cardboard is that water will move through it. And so you are going to have that temporary mulch with the cardboard there. But ideally, you are going to have that mulch and cardboard breakdown over time, and it's not going to be a permanent barrier for that. So I would definitely look at your tree roots because, and like the flare and the base of your tree, because there has been a legacy of over mulching trees and mulch volcanoes around trees. And so it may be, depending on how a specific tree was managed, you can like look up videos on how to tell where the proper part of the root flare of a tree is, and you may need to excavate out from your tree actually before you really want to add any more material onto it, especially if you've ever had a volcano mulch situation around your tree. And now the industry standard is what I'll call a saucer. So if before you had a volcano that was kind of like a triangle up here, now it's more of like your mulch almost is like flat, and then there's a bowl, and it's like like topography goes down towards that root flare where it's flush around, so that water can actually pool into the mulch and then help soak in for the water. So this is how newer, or I don't know, newer, but this is the more modern way to properly mulch a tree. And so perhaps, you know, if you're utilizing that methodology and you have that little bowl of mulch around, then you can have your cardboard and your plants outside of that saucer that is maybe like 1 to 2 feet out from where your root flare is.
Not a question, but a comment in the chat. Kim says, for sheet mulching on slopes, I've also used logs to help stabilize the cardboard and mulch. So besides the bricks, use some logs too. Nice. We could probably take 1 or 2 more questions if there are any.
This might be a question more appropriate for Julia next month, but I'll be mulching before next month comes. So what do you think about getting your mulch from a community compost site? I mean, I'm worried about, like, I haven't done it now in a couple of years because I'm afraid that I might get jumping worms. But do you think that's a concern with mulch versus compost?
This is an excellent question. So jumping worms are often associated with soils. And if you are transplanting plants, maybe you're accidentally getting a jumping worm and then you're moving them, right? And so if you have people who are using the community compost pile and digging up old plants or excavating certain areas and they're dumping that, that is a risk for moving jumping worms. Now, it would be interesting to inquire about the practices that are utilized by the specific composting place that you're getting from, because there are certain methods where compost is being made by applying pressure and temperature in order to break that compost down faster. And you often see that in more urban areas. I'm not familiar with how Minneapolis and St. Paul manage their piles. I'll tell you, out in outstate Minnesota, that doesn't happen. And there's just a big gravel lot that everybody throws their stuff into and it gets turned by a tractor occasionally. That's a big risk. I would not get compost out of a situation like that. But if you have a compost facility that is managing their intake, using high amounts of heat and or pressure that would kill an organism like a jumping worm, then it may be okay. Mulch, again, you want to look at the source of the mulch. So oftentimes mulch is just coming from trees that are being chipped. And like if anybody has ever ordered chip drop before, like that's just like arborists who are felling trees and they need to dispose of the biomass and they run it through a wood chipper and then they dump it on people's driveways occasionally, right? That I think would have a lower risk because you're starting with the above ground woody vegetation that is going to create mulch. I would be really interested to hear what Julia has to say about that because she really is the local expert on what those risks would be. But my take is that mulch, less risky, compost, much more risky, and I would need to do some investigation about practices before I would feel okay taking something like that.
You can cook your own compost too, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it's kind of one of those things too, where it's like, you sometimes don't want to apply a lot of too much heat and pressure, because when you're getting rid of the maybe not so good organisms, you could also be killing the good organisms, right? So there definitely is a trade-off with that. But I think when we're talking about invasive species and we know the harm that worms can do, especially to our native ecosystems, that it might be a risk that you have to take. And maybe there are other ways to try and introduce that microbial life into your garden through things like compost tea, mycorrhizal applications, things like that, that might be able to help encourage those little populations of unseen friends in our garden.
We do one more quick question and then we'll wrap up here.
So many of the ground covers that you've mentioned here, they seem a little more specialized or unique. Are they readily found at a lot of nurseries, or are they more of a higher end specialized nursery that you order these from?
That's a great question. So all of these plants today that I talked about are native North American species. And although our traditional nursery industry is getting a little bit better and better each year about supplying these things, almost all of the species we talked about today, you will have to source from a native plant nursery. And in Minnesota and Wisconsin, we're really lucky because we have a really robust native plant industry, more so than a lot of other places around the nation. So you will have to look at special nurseries. And so mail order, there's a number of them where you can go online and order plants during certain times of the year. But at this time of the year, especially if you're a Twin Cities resident, there are going to be a number of really awesome plant sales that are going to happen this spring. I'm sure Wild Ones has a list, or you can find a list. There's a whole bunch of them that will happen that are in person. Because honestly, the thing about the mail order nurseries at this time of year is that they're sold out. If you're buying from a mail order nursery, you need to buy your plants in like January, like no joke, like plan your garden after Christmas, get your plant order in January, and then they won't ship until spring. But that, I mean, it's convenient to do mail order plants because they just show up at your door one day. However, if you're waiting till this time of the season to think about it, it's so much better to support all of the really great local organizations. There's going to be plant sales at SWCDs, watershed districts, nonprofit organizations. It's coming. Nice, awesome. Their landscape revival.
Next month, Julia comes and talks about dumping worms. She'll also share how we can safely share plants. These plants, you know, wild strawberries for Virginia waterleaf are something that a lot of us have. And if we can learn how to share them safely, then we can do that.
Do we know the dates still of landscape revivals? Because there's two different places. One's in, again, it's the third, I think.
Yes, so I have the details on that. So June 3rd will be at Oakdale City Hall, and then June 10th, it will be in Shoreview at Shepherds of the Hill Church. So that's the landscape revival, and that info, you can find it on our website, bigriverbigwoods.org. Kaitlyn, did you have any final things you want to add?
No, just thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me to come up and speak. I really respect and admire the work of the Wild Ones, and the work that everybody is doing up in the Twin Cities is definitely inspiring more work all around the state and hopefully even in other states. So I just want to say, keep up the great work. And I hope to see you all again soon.